Walking into your friend's apartment to check on them, only to find a tragic and deeply disturbing crime scene, is a nightmare that stays with the family forever. An Arlington, Texas household, 32-year-old Irasema Chavez was found murdered inside her home on January 20, 2012. When a family member went to check on Irasema after she missed her phone calls, they walked inside and found that she had tragically passed away inside her home. She had suffered more than 100 stab wounds. A television was missing from the master bedroom, which is why prosecutors filed a capital murder charge combining the homicide with a robbery. Interestingly, investigators noticed that a recording device was left behind at the scene, capturing footage of a hooded individual entering the apartment. While processing the scene, crime scene investigators found a crucial piece of physical evidence, a droplet of blood on the television stand. However, a major controversy quickly arose. Police affidavits noted that the blood appeared glistening and fresh, even though the body was found roughly 10 hours after the incident, leading defense teams to question how the sample could remain wet for that long. The real turning point came years later through modern technology. In November of 2024, the Arlington Police Department teamed up with the FBI Dallas field office to run investigative genetic genealogy on that evidence. By April of 2026, the genealogy work pointed toward a 42-year-old woman named Mayra Velasquez, who worked locally as a real estate agent and had once been a close friend of Irasema. Once detectives had her on their radar, they quietly gathered fresh evidence. In May of 2026, undercover officers tracked Mayra down and collected a discarded fork she left behind at a location to obtain a direct DNA sample. The lab results matched the blood droplet from the television stand. Defense lawyers immediately pushed back, pointing out that because the two women were close friends who regularly hung out at the apartment, finding Mayra's DNA inside the home was entirely normal. On July 17, 2026, specialized police units took Mayra into custody and booked her on capital murder charges. The legal status shifted dramatically just weeks later. On July 29, 2026, after posting a bond of $450,000, Mayra was released from jail. She was fitted with a GPS ankle monitor and restricted to Dallas and Tarrant counties. Just days later, Mayra stepped in front of the cameras alongside her defense lawyers for a public press conference. Speaking directly to the media, she publicly declared her total innocence, stating that she could never harm her friend and that investigators had targeted the wrong person. Her defense team also highlighted the surveillance video of the hooded figure, arguing that the person's physical build and walking gait clearly match a male rather than Mayra. With her defense actively challenging the forensic timeline and the DNA presence, this high-profile case remains wide open and heavily active. Back in March of 1993, 19-year-old Carmen Van Huss was living alone in an apartment at the Turtle Creek Apartments complex located on Harcourt Road in Indianapolis, Indiana. She had plans and a steady job at a local restaurant, but everything changed overnight. On the night of March 23, 1993, terrifying screams echoed through the thin walls of the complex. For nearly 30 agonizing minutes, neighbors heard her fighting back and crying out for help, but tragically no one called 911. When Carmen failed to show up for work the next day, a coworker called her family. Her father drove over to the apartment, walked inside through an unlocked door, and found that she had tragically passed away inside her home. The crime scene showed she had been subjected to a violent attack, having been stabbed 61 times with a knife. Detectives collected physical and DNA evidence, but back in the 1990s, forensic technology had severe limits. The investigation faced a major roadblock years later due to an administrative mishap. In 2015, a forensic lab made a critical error by accidentally testing the wrong evidence sample, which stalled the momentum of the inquiry and delayed real progress for another 3 years. The true breakthrough finally came in 2018 when cold case investigators teamed up with a specialized DNA technology company to run proper genetic genealogy profiling. By the summer of 2023, the digital search pointed right toward a man named Dana Shepard. Detectives discovered that back in 1993, Shepard had actually lived in the exact same Turtle Creek apartment complex as Carmen. Authorities quietly tracked him down to Missouri, where he was working as a custodian. In early 2024, they obtained a fresh DNA sample from him and ran traditional testing, which matched the physical evidence from the crime scene. In August of 2024, law enforcement arrested the 52-year-old and brought him back to Indiana. In January of 2026, Dana Shepard struck a deal with prosecutors. Under the terms of the plea agreement, the state agreed to dismiss the secondary charges, including the rape counts, and in exchange, Shepard officially pleaded guilty to murder. Following the plea, the formal resolution arrived on February 13, 2026. The judge officially sentenced him to 45 years in prison. Because the crime took place in 1993, the judge explicitly noted that old state laws apply. Under those guidelines, good behavior cuts the prison sentence in half, meaning Shepard will only serve about 22.5 years behind bars and could walk free when he is in his mid-70s. Despite this legal loophole, the plea deal brought a definitive legal conclusion to one of the most haunting cold cases in local history. Living alone in an apartment complex can feel secure until a local neighbor crosses the boundary from friendly proximity into targeted violence. That is exactly what happened in Mesa, Arizona, when 22-year-old Susan Amy Morse was found murdered inside her home in October of 1989. Back then, Susan lived by herself in an apartment complex located near Country Club Drive and Southern Avenue. On October 16, 1989, neighbors realized something was terribly wrong after she failed to show up for work, prompting a welfare check. When Mesa police officers forced entry into her apartment, they discovered a devastating scene. Susan was lying unresponsive on the bed, having suffered severe blunt force trauma to various parts of her body, along with fatal oxygen deprivation. The perpetrator had carefully laid her body out on the bed and pulled the bed covers up over her, showing a twisted sense of intimacy or remorse. Investigators processed the apartment and recovered crucial forensic evidence, but the initial leads dried up fast. Witnesses noted that Susan had last seen her late the previous night, leaving detectives with no clear indication of whether she willingly opened her door to someone she recognized, or if an intruder forced his way inside. The physical evidence could not match anyone in active databases. The case quickly turned cold. Just over a year later, on November 13, 1990, a second violent attack occurred at that exact same Mesa apartment complex. A masked intruder broke into a 23-year-old single mother's home, physically overpowered her, and subjected her to a assault before stealing cash and a VCR and fleeing into the night. Fortunately, the second victim fought back fiercely and survived her injuries. During that desperate struggle, the attacker left behind a crucial physical signature, a clear palm print on a surface inside the apartment. Years later, in November of 2002, forensic analysts ran the DNA profiles and officially linked the samples from the 1990 assault to the unsolved 1989 murder of Susan, proving the exact same predator was operating inside the complex. Using advanced DNA phenotyping, family line genealogy, and a direct palm print comparison that matched an old misdemeanor fingerprint record from their databases, authorities identified a 58-year-old man named Thomas David Cox, living in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Investigators uncovered a chilling local connection. Back in 1989, Thomas Cox's mother had actually lived right next door to Susan. FBI agents and Mesa police detectives descended on Colorado, securing a fresh DNA sample and confirming the physical matches. In April of 2022, Cox was formally arrested and extradited back to Arizona. Prosecutors hit him with a massive 16-count indictment covering both the 1989 murder of Susan and the violent 1990 assault. Thomas Cox stood in court on February 2, 2024, and officially pleaded guilty to first-degree premeditated murder and aggravated assault. On March 15, 2024, the judge formally sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of release after serving 25 years for the homicide, alongside a concurrent 10-year sentence for the assault. The surviving victim of the 1990 attack spoke out during the legal proceedings, highlighting how she kept Susan's fight alive for decades, bringing long overdue accountability. Coming home or checking on a loved one, only to find a tragic and deeply unsettling crime scene leaves a lifelong scar on a family. That was the grim reality in Desert Hot Springs, California, when 39-year-old Cheri Huss was found murdered inside her apartment on April 24, 1994. At the time, Cheri was a dedicated mother of 3 children who had recently moved into a 4-plex apartment building located on Parma Drive. In the weeks leading up to her tragic passing, she had confided in several close family members about feeling deeply uneasy in her new environment. She mentioned strange occurrences like receiving silent phone calls late at night and noticing someone appearing to take photographs outside her windows. On the weekend of her death, her children were spending time with their father, leaving her completely by herself in the apartment. When her parents drove over to check on her the following morning after she failed to answer their calls, they walked inside through the door and found that she had tragically passed away, with her body lying on the floor. The interior of the apartment showed unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. Investigators determined that Cheri had bravely fought back against her assailant, suffering multiple knife wounds during the fierce physical confrontation. In the middle of the attack, the perpetrator bit her directly on the neck, leaving behind distinct saliva evidence, and also bled at the scene. Crime scene analysts carefully recovered both biological samples, and subsequent lab testing confirmed that the male blood matched the DNA found in the saliva from the bite marks. Local authorities immediately entered the DNA profile into state and national databases like CODIS, running searches repeatedly over the years, but it produced 0 matches. In early 2022, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Team utilized advanced forensic genetic genealogy to re-examine the physical evidence. By building out comprehensive family trees from the preserved DNA profile, genetic genealogists narrowed their focus down to a man named Sharon Eugene Gadlin. Investigators discovered that back in 1994, Gadlin had lived in nearby Thousand Palms, located just 12 miles away from Cheri's apartment. On February 14, 2022, authorities obtained a search warrant to collect a direct saliva sample from Gadlin. Just 4 days later, on February 18, the State Department of Justice lab confirmed a direct and undeniable DNA match. On March 4, 2022, law enforcement officers pulled over Gadlin's vehicle in Gardena, California, and took him into custody without incident. In August of 2023, a grand jury formally indicted the then 50-year-old Gadlin on a count of first-degree murder. Gadlin entered a plea of not guilty following the indictment. Because of multiple defense continuances and ongoing pretrial motions within the Riverside County court system, the case remains active in the pretrial phase as lawyers prepare for the final proceedings. Hitchhiking across state lines used to be a common way for young people to travel, but it carried hidden dangers that could turn a simple trip into a nightmare. That was the tragic reality for 25-year-old Mary Kay Schlais, whose life was brutally cut short in the winter of 1974. On the morning of February 15, 1974, Mary left her apartment in uptown Minneapolis carrying a sign that read Madison, with plans to attend an art show in Chicago. She frequently hitchhiked and felt comfortable traveling that way. Her roommate was the last person to see her alive, noting that Mary was dressed in a tan coat and carrying her purse. Just a few hours later, a driver exploring a rural area in Dunn County, Wisconsin, roughly 90 miles away from Minneapolis, noticed something alarming. He witnessed 2 people struggling near a rural roadside intersection in Springbrook Township near 408th Avenue and 990th Street. When he returned shortly after to check on the situation, the gold-colored compact car and the driver were gone, but Mary's body was left lying in a nearby roadside ditch. An autopsy revealed that Mary had suffered a broken nose alongside at least 15 stab wounds during the physical struggle. The tight timeline from when she left her apartment to when her body was discovered indicated that the killer likely drove straight to the rural dump site. Local law enforcement launched a massive investigation, conducting hundreds of interviews and following tips across multiple states and Canada over the years. Investigators even looked into whether the notorious serial killer Randall Woodfield, known as the I-5 killer, might have been responsible while passing through the state, but forensic technology at the time was far too limited to find a definitive link. Among the physical items recovered at the crime scene was a stocking hat left behind by the perpetrator. Investigators carefully preserved the hat, hoping that future technology might unlock its secrets. Over the course of the next several decades, authorities examined multiple items of evidence as DNA technology evolved, yet no viable suspects emerged from standard databases like CODIS, leaving the file gathering dust. The turning point finally arrived thanks to modern advancements in genetic genealogy. Investigators from the Dunn County Sheriff's Office teamed up with the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center at Ramapo College. Experts extracted a partial male DNA profile from the preserved stocking hat, eventually isolating a suspect named John Keith Miller, who lived in the region back in 1974. On November 7, 2024, law enforcement officers moved in and arrested the 84-year-old Miller at his home in Owatonna, Minnesota. When detectives sat him down and confronted him with the DNA evidence pulled from the stocking hat, investigators pieced together that he had picked Mary up while she was hitchhiking, asked her for physical intimacy, and when she firmly refused, he grabbed a weapon and attacked her. Facing the overwhelming forensic evidence, Miller entered a no-contest plea to first-degree intentional homicide. On March 27, 2025, the court officially sentenced him, ordering financial restitution. In a powerful display of grace, Mary family chose to donate a portion of that restitution money straight back to the Ramapo College IGG team to help them solve even more forgotten cold cases. 84-year-old Wilma Mobley was found murdered inside her home in Jerome, Idaho, on August 10, 1995. On that morning, local authorities responded to a homicide report at Wilma's residence. When officers walked inside, they discovered a devastating scene. Wilma had been attacked and passed away from severe oxygen deprivation alongside heavy physical trauma. During the initial 1995 investigation, gathered evidence led detectives to identify 3 potential local suspects, focusing heavily on a man named Danny Lee Kennison who lived nearby. Detectives were so convinced of his involvement that they actually submitted an arrest warrant affidavit against him to the court. However, prosecutors rejected the request at the time, stating that a lack of concrete physical evidence made it impossible to move forward. Without conclusive physical evidence directly tying any of the suspects to the crime scene, the leads dried up. Following the murder, Kennison eventually left Jerome and relocated to Filer, Idaho. The investigation eventually stalled out, turning Wilma's tragic death into a cold case. Over the following years, multiple agencies, including the Idaho State Police and the FBI, reviewed the old files. In 2006, the department even brought the case to the Vidocq Society, but it only generated minor leads that ultimately went nowhere. The real turning point finally arrived in the summer of 2022, when a dedicated detective sergeant took over the stagnant case file. Recognizing that modern science had evolved past the limits of 1995, he coordinated with the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab to re-examine the preserved physical evidence. In March of 2023, specific items recovered from the original crime scene, including material from the victim's clothing, were submitted for advanced DNA testing. The breakthrough came on December 18, 2023. State lab technicians reported finding a significant DNA profile matching Danny Lee Kennison on the clasp of the victim's clothing items. Investigators quickly cross-referenced the findings and confirmed that Kennison had been a direct neighbor back in 1995. Because Kennison had tragically taken his own life at his home in Filer, Idaho, back in March of 2001, a traditional criminal trial could no longer take place. However, with the DNA evidence completely isolating him and eliminating all other initial theories, spending Valentine's Day waiting for your fiancé to return from a business trip should be a moment of excitement, but it can turn into an ultimate nightmare. That was the tragic reality for 22-year-old UT Arlington student Terri McAdams. On February 14, 1985, Terri was staying at her fiancé's apartment while he was out of town, and she had lovingly baked a heart-shaped cake to surprise him upon his return. While she was inside the residence, an intruder forced his way past a bedroom sliding glass door, leaving a distinct footprint in the dirt outside, and launched a devastating attack. An apartment maintenance man discovered her body inside the residence later on. When local law enforcement officers processed the scene, they encountered a heartbreaking crime scene showing she had suffered severe blunt force injuries. Investigators also noted that the perpetrator had stolen Terri's engagement ring from the apartment before fleeing. They collected physical and biological evidence meticulously. With limited leads, the investigation gradually lost momentum, turning into a cold case for nearly 4 decades. In 2024, dedicated investigators teamed up with specialized forensic laboratories to apply advanced genetic genealogy techniques to the preserved biological evidence from the 1985 crime scene. By building out comprehensive family trees from the DNA profile, genetic genealogists successfully narrowed down their search to a man named Bernard Sharp. Investigators uncovered a chilling background history about Sharp. He was a known serial rapist and just 9 months after murdering Terri in November of 1985, Sharp had taken his own life and those of his family members during a violent, multi-victim tragedy. Because he was already deceased, he never faced a traditional courtroom trial for what he did to Terri. Following the definitive genetic confirmation linking him to the evidence, the Arlington Police Department and the FBI officially announced the resolution of the case on August 14, 2024. This brought long overdue answers and a sense of closure to Terri and McAdams' family, proving once again that modern science can successfully pierce decades-old mysteries. Living on your own in a quiet apartment complex can feel secure until a familiar face turns out to be a fatal threat. That was the devastating reality in Wichita, Kansas, when 20-year-old Krista Martin was found murdered inside her home on South Osage Street on October 2, 1989. Early that morning, a concerned friend visited Krista's apartment and found her unresponsive. Responding officers from the Wichita Police Department arrived to process the scene. Investigators noted that there was zero sign of forced entry into the apartment, strongly indicating that Krista either knew her attacker and willingly opened the door, or that the intruder slipped inside unnoticed. Inside, they discovered that she had suffered assault, followed by fatal blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by an unknown weapon that the killer took from the scene. In a chilling detail, despite the violent nature of the assault, her body was found fully clothed, suggesting the perpetrator attempted to dress her afterward to conceal the crime. Although detectives carefully collected and preserved biological evidence, forensic technology in 1989 lacked the capability to generate a usable suspect profile. The homicide turned into a cold case for decades. In 2009, the preserved evidence was submitted to the local Forensic Science Center, resulting in a suspect profile that was uploaded to CODIS, but it yielded zero matches. The file went cold once more until the department partnered with the Advanced Forensic Laboratory Othram in 2020 to build a viable DNA profile. Following the lab work, the investigation entered a massive multi-state phase. In 2021, a Wichita homicide detective and an FBI special agent traveled across Alabama and Arkansas to interview distant relatives, successfully mapping out the family tree. By April of 2023, the genetic genealogy work finally generated a breakthrough, pointing investigators toward a man named Paul Hart. They uncovered a major twist. Hart had died years earlier in a traffic collision in Memphis, Tennessee, in March of 1999. In June of 2023, authorities collected reference DNA samples from Hart's direct relatives and confirmed a definitive match to the 1989 crime scene evidence. When the completed investigation was presented to the local district attorney, officials noted that formal charges would have been filed if Hart were still alive. Because the perpetrator was deceased, the department officially cleared the case in October of 2023.